this beginning chatter at the beginning of the Zoom call always seems to point us towards something. So the question is just pacing, right? Oh, I don't feel well to do the call today. Let's reschedule. But in that, there's an intelligence, there's a wisdom in the body there. And I think what's coming to me is how we override that wisdom, especially in moments like the one we're in, right? Like, oh, this is really important, somehow becomes equal to this has to happen or super quickly.
Yes.
to get completed right away.
Urgency.
I think there's a lot to talk about, but I'd love to just really be easeful in it, right? To be aware of ourselves as we're in the conversation.
Yeah.
It's great to see you both.
Yeah, great.
It's great to see you. I think that's very, very wise. Well, like you just mentioned with Javier, like language brings with it trajectory and form. And, one of the things I just think the debate on freedom and determinism needs to be focused on language, because we often are kind of determined by language, by the words, to say certain things or to act in certain ways. And you can actually feel a certain determinism in the momentum of current events, a certain sort of pulling you forth, a certain need to respond, a need to say everything, to hit everything, that actually that very urgency is a kind of force of determinism that's very problematic. Because even talking about all of these topics in terms of that urgency is already, in a sense, conceding a lot of ground. Like it is already accepting a certain framing within which no possible address may be possible. Maybe it's possible, but here's the issue. You always want to be conscious of the framing or the mode by which you enter into a conversation, because every mode and framing already kind of sets the board of what is possible to think. And it could be the case that of all the possibilities within that frame, none of them are adequate, actually, once you accept that frame. So it actually becomes really important to have that moment of going, well, let's not be so quick to let the momentum of what's going on set the tone of the discussion. That's an act of agency and an act of freedom, without which it might already be too late. And I actually think that's part to what we were just saying about the ability to say, not tonight, let's do next week. Let's do a different time. I think that's another act of agency that is trying to escape the content creating endless production course. And I actually don't think this work or this space is sustainable without that feeling of freedom to do that. Like that ability to move, otherwise it will become endless content creation that crushes us all. And I think that is and then it's kind of game over because, and then I'll stop. If you are operating in a content creation machine, that in of itself leads to part of the problem, because everyone is having to put out videos on Kirk, right? Everyone is having to respond, right? Well, that very machine operating within it may cut out certain possibilities of thought and address that, if lost, you've already lost too much ground, right? So I think that's just, the medium is the message, the medium is the frame. Like if you can't think that, you're already kind of in trouble. So I just really appreciate what you were saying there, Seth.
Yeah, me too. I don't have a lot to add to that. There's a percolating that I like to talk about is happening for me, like to take time, and it happens hand in hand with that other force that's a more urgent force. Like I need to declare what's happening for me right now about this. But both things are happening at once. And I think the confusion too can be that there is a way that we can move to avoidance. It's more about avoidance of discussion or conversation or putting words to what's happening. That can be about something else, perhaps more of an emotional avoidance or uncertainty about a relationship, being able to hold something. And those things it takes some time to be able to discern the difference, I think, between I am honoring the part of me that is still percolating, and there's almost a restorative component to it as well, versus this is the force inside me that is trying to convince me, don't do that now because we don't know what will come from it. Right. So I do think there is, I mean, I see that a lot in my work with clients, that trying to discern the difference between those two things is really important. But the other bit I wanted to add about being able to so comfortably delay our meetings and to request that from you both is that it also, there's a relational context in which I feel settled to be able to do that. You know, there's a trust component that goes with it, that in suggesting, can we wait a week? Can we wait a couple more weeks? That there won't be, you know, risk of disconnection, right? Like worst case scenario, relationship comes to an end, or, you know, there's been too many reschedules. This isn't going to work. Like this kind of, there is a manner in which we learn these patterns of needing to be more responsive to the others in the relationship, less responsive to our own needs, only putting forth our own needs in certain scenarios. So it's just, I'm really grateful to both of you that despite the nature of the relationship, like this isn't just a normal kind of friendship where we met, you know, down in town and, you know, like sort of developed a friendship over time. It's a very particular kind of way that we met. And there's an ambiguity that goes with that. And I just feel very grateful that even in that context, I feel a genuine connection with each of you, that feels, that is a friendship. And that means that even though these conversations are not just friendship, there's like another component to it as well, that I still feel confidence to be able to say, actually, I need to respect what's happening for me today. Can we put it off? And that's not always the case. So I think that's important too. But I agree too, Seth, with the pace component. There's always a lot that's coming up inside me when we meet. Even though we meet regularly, it's still like, I've been waiting for this conversation. But it's nice to just sit sometimes and see what comes to the forefront as opposed to working it up. Yeah.
Well, I love that I can feel all of the things that I think there are to talk about under the surface of everything that's being said already. Like just one little example, you used the word percolating. And I thought, well, that's not the right word to describe what the culture is doing right now. But there's also a way that, like, that was such a precise phenomenological, like I knew, oh, she's percolating, right? But, you know, as to what Daniel was saying about the content creation angle, I mean, you know who does put out content every day? ABC, NBC, you know, like all the major media. That is how they, and I noticed, I guess it was during COVID, because whatever was the big thing before that, I probably didn't have a cell phone. But during COVID, especially as, you know, this started to happen in Europe and Italy, and then we saw pictures, but everything's fine in the US, and now, oh, now it's on our doorstep. Oh, there's cases in my city. That really glued me to my phone for a while, right? And I've noticed with the news, when there are these moments, and Charlie Kirk is another one, but there's been many in between, there's this way I respond to, like, I really do need to find out, since 45 minutes have gone by since the last time I did it, if something, you know, and I'm like, I'm falling into that rabbit hole. And I feel that, you know, in this moment. Now, I think part of that is just a real thing. Like, I think a lot of people are doing that. But it also underlines why it's valuable to slow down. But it's true, like, as I put out content, I feel called to speak to this thing. And what's actually been interesting is to notice recently, this is just maybe speaking to my own trajectory because of people will be at different places, but I actually feel something that I really appreciate about feeling called to speak, because I just do the work that I do because my strange idiosyncratic life story ended me up in these shoes, right? But I mean, I think that whatever our line of work is or whatever it is we spend a lot of our time, like every person has that longing to know that this what I do is meaningful, right? And at the same time, if I think about the work I do and I think, oh, the kind of work I do could actually weigh in the balance in a meaningful way, but then of course I could fail to show up and I could fail to do my work, and so like there's a sense of the stakes going up that feels in the right moment, it feels good, actually. It's like, oh, this is an opportunity, because if I say something that might be slightly different than what other people are saying, I notice people listen in a different way. I mean, this is so much appreciation again for your work and Michelle's work, Daniel, the work of O.G. Rose, because I think that, last time you said, if we don't figure this out, we're doomed, right? And we could feel that doom. But
and what a moment! Can I just say the timing of that, and then what subsequently happened was just
And then so I've had conversations with you. We did a call just talking about a few things a week ago, and then I'm thinking of when you were speaking with Javier. He said something that I thought, thank you for saying what everyone's thinking. And Javier just said, oh, some people are going to think that this idea of figuring out how we can be harmonious under global pluralism, that just doesn't sound very realistic, does it? But then, because he said it, you got to engage in the conversation about what does it mean when we label something unrealistic or not. I mean, all of these things, they're like, and it's also, as you said, Daniel, it's language, right? That word, unrealistic, it already is, it's like this signal. Oh, do you really want to work really hard for nothing? And everyone's like, well, no, I don't want to do that. Okay, well then forget about the work of O.G. Rose, because it's just gonna, or whatever. But as soon as you do slow down and then you hear, an argument that makes sense to you, it's like, oh, this is just something that no one has pointed out before, but now I hear it, and I feel that in the air right now too. There's some specific things around Charlie Kirk that I could point to, and I feel like that would already be rushing ahead, so I'm not going to do it. But I think it's really, I'll just end with this. Something you were saying, Aspasia, again, like the idea of percolating. Like you say that, and I feel a sense of, oh, I know what you mean. And in that moment, relationally, phenomenologically, I situate. It's actually, it's like we're building the map of this conversation a little, right? We could say. But I think what I'd like to say, and really invite even our listeners, if I can like notice that they're there for a moment, is this is a moment to observe the phenomenology of the culture moment by moment. Really, it's unfolding. There's a press conference or there's a viral video, and these are moments in the life of the nervous system, of the collective nervous system, and we can begin to, I think that's an awareness that we can begin to grow. That's what I talk about when I use the phrase musicality of being. And I think a number of people are already doing that. It's like, oh, I'm speaking and someone's nodding their head, or someone has this expression. But it's like, I could even stand in a room and just watch other people speak and watch the currents that are sort of flowing there. And I think moments like this really make that more apparent. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for everything you said, Seth and Aspasia, and thank you for your kind words as well, Seth. I think, one of those kind of ideas, first off, a lot of what people call unrealistic, as I was speaking with Javier about, it also, we should be careful to say something is impossible before people have seen it and outright dismissed it, right? I think a lot of things that we say would never work, well, the average person has never seen. We haven't seen what the average person does when they're exposed to this, right? Like, we actually don't know what the average person would do. So in my opinion, I believe basically few people have ever experienced literature as literature should be experienced, or had a philosophical conversation as philosophy should be talked. Not as the history of philosophy, but an actual sort of closer to something like a dialogos or a certain sort of deepening, right? I have never ever met a person, rather it be at the wedding venue, a guest I'm speaking with, at the hardware store, where you can sense, oh, it would be appropriate actually to bring a little bit of maybe the philosophical depth, that I have not found that person interested, that they actually will engage, right? That they don't go, oh, blah, I hate this. No, if you actually do it in the right way, that actually many people, we would sit in Big T with the fish fry on Friday night before the Friday night football game, and there were plenty of people gathered around who would be talking about philosophy, politics, religion, and stuff like that, right? It's so we should not be quick to assume something about people who have never had a chance to see that thing we're assuming they would reject, right?
Mm-hmm.
Look, if everyone is basically going around saying, a lot of people are saying colleges have failed, school has failed, it's not really giving a good education. Oh, okay, so you mean the average person has never experienced education like it should be because the system has failed. So why are we so quick to assume people are not interested in deeper topics or don't want to have an education? As far as I can tell, it looks like a lot of people are going online and engaging in self-education by their own without certification. That should be a very encouraging fact, that so many people would actually be doing what we're doing just because they've been exposed to it, just because they've seen it, right? So one should slow down before they pass a judgment on what is unrealistic or not, especially in a world that lacks exposure of certain possibilities, right? I think also what is very interesting, because mentioning Kirk, it makes me think of the eternal, I think it's called The Eternal Husband in Dostoevsky. And there's this story, this idea classically in Russia, if somebody died, I believe the body was left on the table for 3 days. And the idea that it took, I think, 3 days for the soul to leave, so you would leave the body there. And so you would go into your kitchen and there would be a body, right? And so a lot of this story of the eternal husband is this character who's like unable to avoid this body, and they're thinking through everything he did with his wife and et cetera, so forth, right? When you have someone die, you can't argue the fact of that death away. It becomes a facticity, right? And it now kind of forces you to respond. Like it's concrete, right? The way I was saying it with Javier, if Kirk is alive and you're with Kirk, you're kind of with him and he's developing. But when he stops, then it hits you. And what ends up happening is that everyone, because we've been talking about internally consistent systems with the book, when you have something happen like what has occurred with Kirk, everyone is forced to fall back on their map to explain this thing. Because now you can no longer put off your assessment because it's over. It's almost like this idea in religion that there can be this idea that at the end of your life, you get a kind of a flashback, or God judges your entire life, et cetera, so forth. Well, there's a way in which when other people die, that we find ourselves no longer able to put off an assessment of what we think their life meant. And we are actually going to have to do it in terms of the internal consistency of the ideology we have used to understand our own lives, right? So what is happening with Kirk, uniquely, because he was such a public figure, and the death of Kirk is very, I want to say, I don't want to say unique, because there has been people who have been killed like this, but he's not a I mean, you could say he's a politician because he has that big influence on young Republican men. You could frankly argue he was the leader of recruiting young conservative men to the MAGA cause or different things. But it's not like he's a senator. It's not like he's a president. He's not a vice president. He's mostly a pundit, right? He's mostly someone who talks for a living, right? That is very interesting. And, for people to target that individual, right? Someone who doesn't have any direct political power. It's not like he is going to he doesn't have executive power. He can't write a law, right? All he can do is speak, right? So in a sense, he has no power. And in another way, he has infinite power, right? Like he's incredibly powerful. So there's an ambiguity, okay? The other thing that Kirk represents is the great debate on is speech violent or not? Like, is speech itself an act of violence or isn't it? And there are people that debate. And that's an ambiguity, right? What has happened with Kirk is because what I'm getting at is the meaning of Kirk is in all senses an ambiguity. It is not clear. Like if it was a senator who was killed, we can say, oh, he had power. But with someone like Kirk, it's like, did he have power? Did he not have power? You say, was he violent? Was he not violent? Was he dangerous? Was he not? It's all ambiguous. And because he's ambiguous, what's happening is everyone is having to explain that ambiguity into a clear meaning according to their ideology, because they're forced to do it by the fact that he is dead, and you have to do a final assessment because it's now over. You can't put that off. And so you have a certain ambiguity that Kirk stands in for, that I would argue the entire political landscape is actually split along the lines of this ambiguity on, are words violent or not? Is power in politics or is in power in media? Is power in the celebrity or is it in politics? Where is power located actually today? That is debated. People actually are not sure. It's ambiguous. What is violence? We're ambiguous about that. And everyone is now finding themselves, because Kirk was such a big name and the media is talking about it, and there's also this urgency to respond, everyone in a way is kind of having to show their position on that ambiguity. And they don't know what the other side, because other people could take another side of that ambiguity, right? So it is also feeling like people are showing their cards. And the feeling, and increasingly people have a feeling of a certain civil war, right? A feeling of a certain violence, because once you show your cards, you can't unshow them. Once you show your perspective on this, then people know it, right? And it becomes a debate of first principles where people have entirely different first principles by which they understand reality. And you can't reverse those. Those are the very bedrocks by which you understand reality, right? So those are becoming more vivid, right? Because people, and as those become more vivid, the intensity of the difference becomes more pronounced because ambiguity was actually concealing it from you. Like the very not having to take a side in the ambiguity, but occupying the ambiguity as a safe space, could keep the differences from feeling so intense. But now that people are like, oh, people are shooting bullets, people are dying, oh, well, we have to take solid sides then. We have to come down hard. That's a significant shift. And that is when people are finding themselves responding to, and perhaps not having the education or the sense of how to respond to it. And here's the other issue, why I liked your opening statements, Seth. The way you respond to something so definite, like making the ambiguity solid on your perspective, if you do that in a way that is set by content creation or speed or momentum versus artful or your own terms, the likelihood you do it in a very problematic way, or a way that backfires, or the way that politically sets the tone in not a good way, is much higher. Paul Virilio warned about speed. So when you have a sudden solidification of ambiguity plus speed, plus people also feeling like there are real terms, like real stakes, that creates this sort of overflow of this feeling of almost apocalypse, to use a dramatic term. But apocalypse is not just Armageddon. It also means revelation. Sort of this feeling of, oh, we're actually seeing what the world is actually like now. We're actually seeing where people are. We're having a certain seeing of things that is occurring. Well, I'll close with this for now, is that, in my opinion, when you have a certain feeling of people seeing a truth, offering alternative models is really important, because like we're trying to do, like in the social coordination mechanism, right? Because if all people see is the more Armageddon-like model, the more, apocalypse model, which then they're going to become fatalist, and they're going to say, well, we've got to accept reality now. We've got to accept that there are murderers in our midst and get rid of them. There are bad people. We've just got to accept that, right? And that people can't overcome their differences. They can't talk through their differences. They're not able to handle their differences. Well, then we're just going to have to accept that reality. That's, in that world, models that are showing the alternative, in my opinion, become all the more important. because otherwise people become hopeless, right? And they become disengaged. And I think that also the other thing to model is that sublation between seriousness, but also not being rushed. That taking things seriously, but not pressured, right? That's another thing that people have to see. Like, I don't think people believe now it's possible to take something seriously unless you're frantic, unless you're actually nervously responding, right? The possibility of taking something seriously without being frantic or without being pressured, you know, where you're able to take a week off, for example, that is also something people need to see modeled. And one of the reasons, too, is I think the only way we're going to have any sort of serious change is if people can, well, control their bodies and actually control their nervous system. So that's all part of it as well. But those are just opening thoughts.
Mm. Yeah, and like I do have something to bring in. So when we're talking about, models showing alternatives, I've been going back to this idea we've spoken about before in the last week around the difference between seduction versus intimacy.
Hmm.
I went to this business conference. Anyway, one of the people that speak, it's just it's seduction, right? So like
Yeah.
someone was speaking and it was essentially a presentation on here's interrogation tactics and here's how you can use them to influence and manipulate people to do what you want, all this stuff, which is fine. Like there's a place to talk about those things, but the presentation of it as though this is something useful to cultivate trust with your employees and to, effectively get them to do what you want them to do, as opposed to talking about it as these are interrogation tactics that should be used when you are interrogating someone. Just this faux equivalency of taking skills from one area that are designed to do one thing and thinking that we are so special and powerful and more intelligent than the people around us that we can apply these to everyone else and get them on board. What really aggravates me about it is that it ultimately you're talking about how can you manipulate people into believing that they're having an intimate encounter with you. Just call it what it is. Just say, here's some ways that we can, more subconsciously influence people in the workplace to do the things we want, which is make more profit, be more productive. Like, just call it what it is. There's nothing authentic about what's happening there. It's the appearance of authenticity in order to trick someone else into thinking they're in a particular kind of encounter that they're not. And it's a lie. And I can't stand that. And I think where that relates back to what we're talking about now is just that, a moment like what's happened with Charlie Kirk is a moment where, 1,000,001 people can come out now and seduce others into their perspective and their way of seeing things, and they can do it in such a way that is really trying to come across as not a seduction. This is the thing, it's this is just an authentic expression of my opinion, and I'm just inviting you to consider it and inviting you into a conversation around it. And I think for me, I've been just very interested in this last week around what we do when we are genuinely, authentically inviting another person into a conversation and a dialogue and an exchange of complex positions. There's still a kind of agenda there because we're inviting them into something. But that is sort of more of the agenda, if we call it that. It's the invitation with a complete reverence for the other person's agency and ability to reject us, accept it, come in partially, pull back, whatever. And it's a real equal footing position versus, yeah, just this sort of seductive position of inviting someone in under the pretense that we're going to have a conversation and exchange ideas. but ultimately I'm going to win. And I might even be doing things in that encounter that I believe are manipulating you into my position. So I think that's an important distinction, obviously, in all of this. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Well, I mean, I think people have an antenna for that whenever they turn towards politics, right? What are they trying to get me to do with this press conference? But, you know, there's ways that it's also kind of accepted currency. Like this is how, I mean, I'm thinking of a couple things. Well, so one, to bring in a piece of Charlie Kirk that's I've just seen. So I only have the image, but the image is plenty, which is that there are already viral AI generated videos of Charlie Kirk speaking from after the grave, some of which have been played in mega churches. Well, the one I saw, he literally has angel wings and he's speaking and he's talking. And I really just glimpsed this, but I believe what I saw below the thing was some comment about someone who was really inspired. It's Charlie Kirk, you know, speaking. Even if they understood it was AI, it was like, wow, that was an inspired thing. Ask AI to make this video, whatever it was. But all I can say is it's in the discourse. Whatever you think about that, that is part of the discourse. But when you were speaking, I was also thinking of 1968 to, I guess it was 98. So in 1968, you had massive anti-Vietnam War rallies in Chicago. The cops basically riot, start beating people in the streets, and the cameras switch from the conference to live shots of what's going on. So mayor looks really bad, and then they take up 8 of the main activists and they put them on trial for conspiracy. The Chicago 8 trial, many people call it the Chicago 7 trial because Bobby Seals, the Black Panther, his case was split off. They did things like gag him and tie him to his chair in the courtroom, like outrageous, like just wild. So one of the Chicago 7 is my grandfather, David Dellinger. And, you know, growing up, this is quite the grandfather to have. I don't think I ever actually fully wrapped my mind around the politics, especially when I was young. But, you know, then I grew up and then point in time, I think, you know, I was in college and there was the Iraq War and different things. There was a time when, this is what I was trying to figure out with, I think it was 98. Yeah, it would have been 98. It was the first time the Democrats held their convention in Chicago again, because stay the hell away from Chicago. But, you know, at a certain point, but then everyone, of course, goes, oh, it's 30 years since 68. And so my grandfather was invited onto Larry King Live, along with some of the others. But there was also demonstrations happening. This was the beginning of some of the, like, what they would call anti-globalization, you know, like anti-WTO, you know, like, anyway, my grandfather was going to this. I was in college and so I went with him, you know, and we actually got arrested, you know, in a federal building. We were chanting the names of political prisoners. And then, you know, my mother was, you know, like, oh, you just got arrested with your grandmother. I had to call her and tell Mom. But one of the things that happened was, as I mentioned, he was invited to be on Larry King Live. And because it's the convention, Larry King Live had a studio in the convention center. So we went into the convention center to, you know, go to the studio. And basically we just got to walk for a moment on the floor of where the Democrats would have their convention. And I couldn't tell you how high it was, but what I saw was that the place where Bill Clinton would be speaking, if you were in the room, you would be going like this. He was way up on the podium, like, I don't know if it was 40 feet, 100 feet, but it was way higher than where. And then behind it, of course, was a massive screen, which while he was speaking would be his head. And so just the visual was like, you know, and this is, and the thing was too, it was like, I'd seen conventions on TV. I mean, But to be in the room, I was like, oh, this is where the message is generated. And for the people in the room, they're looking at this like, up at this person way above us with his head, just like the whole, it really made this huge impression on me. And, that was 98. So how far have they gone along the Marshall McLuhan path since then? The medium, this is the message. But anyway, just I'll end here, but to come back, I think, Aspasia, what you're speaking to with this sort of marketing conference you went to, but there's a way that politics and current events are sold to us. And what I heard Daniel saying is, about everyone's maps are getting called for it. I mean, it also feels very much to me, and even feel like I'm understanding more viscerally than ever before this phrase, the girdle point, right? Because if I have an internally consistent map of the world that I just run on all the time, and it has this whole place of ambiguity, I usually never have to deal with that ambiguity most of the time. I only have to deal with it now that Charlie Kirk's been shot. And so, I want to say, quote, the right thing, but I don't know what my friends will think. And then it's like, we're going to get together. And it's like, even like, who's going to open their mouth first? I mean, but in any case, what I would, and this would be my hopeful note, is there's a way that everyone is called to attention. Everyone, I mean, yes, some people, as Daniel said, will be frantic, but to the degree that anyone realizes, oh shit, the stakes just went up. I think everyone is, I mean, Feldenkrais spoke about this. You provoke the brain and it comes to attention. Like he would do things sometimes having people standing on a roller on one leg with one eye closed. And it was like, this is a completely crazy thing to ask a person to do. And he's like, yeah. And if I ask the person to do this, something will appear in that person that they didn't know they had, right? And I think that this is kind of a moment like that. So I'll pass it.
I appreciate everything both of you said. I cannot have part of the consistency of my map the response of the other to my consistency, because that's an analysis of the consistency and therefore cannot be contained or controlled or predicted by the consistency. And furthermore, when I am encountering someone with another map and I'm forced to present my map to them, I have to realize that my map is lacking their first principles or their, say, definition of what constitutes violence. Therefore, the lack of my map is unveiled. And how do you respond to that? Because it could make you realize, oh my gosh, my entire map is just arbitrary. Dang it. Because I could have had different first principles. I could have a different definition of what constitutes violence. I could have another understanding of what is freedom or what is free speech. What am I going to do? How can I incorporate this other person into my map when that would require also bringing in their map that has different first principles that would undermine my first principles by unveiling their arbitrariness? And that is the girdle point. That is all the activity of the girdle point. That if you're not prepared for, and the day comes when you encounter it, you're going to experience it more like a Lovecraft creature. Lacan's the real, it will overwhelm you, and you will have an explosion of probably totalitarian or violence or pulling away, like moving away, right? It's I think what we're seeing. I will also note what Aspasia was saying, and I think this is very, very important, on the difference between manipulation, seduction, and modeling that versus what I believe is extremely important for us to be doing. There is a massive difference between speaking with other people in a manner where you have a quantifiable outcome that you're trying to achieve. Like I have an end in mind that I want to realize, and I'm going to learn the tactics of manipulation to get to that end, right? In an age when you're under the reign of quantification, basically modeling is going to be manipulation. Inspiration is probably going to be seduction, and community is probably going to be incorporation. The only way that you're actually going to have modeling is if your goal is something qualitative and unpredictable. Like I am here to learn how to talk in a manner that increases the probability of something that surprises all of us, including me. I have through my life experience come to believe and experience a certain way of talking, a certain way of approaching ideas that leads to an outcome I can't quantify. I can't make money off of it. I can't put it into numbers, but I can qualitative experience a change that creates intimacy, that brings out something in me and the people around me that otherwise doesn't come out. And that this makes something possible that when humans experience it, they know it, and it's what they long for and it's what they want, but they can't quantify it, but they know it when they get it. And I think that's, of course, tied to authentic resonance. I think basically modeling that isn't manipulation is very seemingly impossible without authentic resonance, because you also don't have the capacity to tell when you've achieved this quality of interaction that is not quantifiable, but incredibly concrete when you experience it, right? Well, if most people, because we as a society have not perhaps provided the resources by which people can have these kind of experiences that I would associate with the strike of beauty, flow, friendship, geopadia, as Jock and Javier and Michelle have spoken about. If we as a society have not provided these experiences for the average person, then we should not be surprised if basically all anyone thinks about modeling or talk is seduction, manipulation, or trying to achieve quantitative goals. They've never seen anything else, right? But that also gives me hope, because maybe they're just doing it because they haven't seen the alternative. So let's not give up. That's what we were saying at the beginning. Because like you say, yes, in a conversation like this, you have a certain agenda. You have a certain goal. You have a certain thing you are trying to achieve. You're not just coming into the conversation without a certain notion of what you are, of that you're trying to do. But the thing you're trying to do is something not entirely in your control. You can't quantify it. And also, I can't afterwards prove to people that I even did anything, right? Only the people in it could possibly know, right? So that difference makes a massive difference, actually. I actually think this point is actually strongly tied to the free speech conversation now going on, that I think is very relevant, because there's a lot of people who are saying Charlie Kirk was a big person of free speech and that we've lost free speech and so on and so forth. I will be very straightforward, though. I have found it incredibly remarkable how many conservatives could talk in the, I was watching, and I've watched it off and on because I like it when they talk about the energy grid and different things. But there's a podcast, it's the All In podcast. It has Trump, it's a bunch of entrepreneurs that get together and talk. They can have good conversation. I really like that one guy, and I forget his name, especially when he starts talking about the energy situation, because I think that's the unappreciated geopolitical problem that will become very pronounced soon, the American electric grid. Anyway,
stay tuned.
So stay tuned. They were talking about Kirk and free speech, and then they talked about Kimmel, and that was not a violation of free speech. And the sort of flip I found incredibly remarkable. Now, the host, he had no problem with it. Now, the host was consistent. He's like, no, that's a violation of free speech. But what have we heard? The Trump administration, they say, no, it was because he had bad ratings. It wasn't a violation of free speech, and he lied. He said something wrong, and so on and so forth. Well, what I want to say is that no one who violates free speech violates free speech. No one ever is doing that. They're stopping violence. They're getting rid of someone who's not telling the truth. He has bad ratings. Well, it just turned out that Kimmel's bad ratings, it's the day after he said something about Kirk that became an issue. The timing is very interesting for that argument, right? Et cetera, so forth. But the point I'm getting at is I would argue that actually we exist in a world where people are talking about free speech, but I would actually argue we don't meet the conditions of possibility to actually have free speech, because we don't actually know how not to manipulate. We don't actually, let me put it this way. There's a big difference between legal free speech and freed speech, speech that is freed. And you actually don't have freed speech just because you have free speech legally. Freed speech is when you're freed of, say, quantification, or you're freed of scoring political points in conversation, or you feel like you can talk about your view of Kirk without losing your friends, without losing your job. Like, Christopher Hitchens said, and this was very wise of him to say, he said, it's not enough to have freedom of speech. You also have to feel like you can speak freely. It's not enough to have the freedom of speech. You also have to feel like you can speak freely. That's 100% the case. We have been going down this road, though, of firing people because they said things we don't like them to say, rather it be Duck Dynasty or COVID or whatever, for a very long time. And so we don't even have a culture anymore that can tell the difference between legal free speech and the social condition that allows speech, right? But the reason I bring all this up is because I actually think freed speech is impossible without experiences of beauty, authentic resonance, geopedia, flow, etc., so forth. Because every time we go into conversation, unless we have had those experiences, we do have an end in mind that we're speaking to. We do have a point we want to make. We do have an outcome we want. In my opinion, a lot of times you're just seeing these people who are on stage who are being explicit about tactics of manipulation. In a sense, they're just making vivid what the average person is constantly doing all the time to one another, because they don't know the alternative, because they've never had experiences of flow, authentic, the ideas arising they've never had before. In a way, the average person has perhaps never had a real conversation, which is a crazy thing to say. But I do think the average person has never had a real conversation. They've actually never had a conversation where hours go by, you didn't know what was going to be said, and all of these things occur. I say that as a sign of hope, because if the average person has never had that, hey, if they do have it and they taste it, then they'll be inspired and they're going to want to do it, right? But I'll close with this. Basically, we can talk about free speech all we want. But if people don't know how to have freed speech, how to free their own speaking from social scripts, from goals of quantification, from scoring points or being right in conversation, from having their ideas structured by a metaphor they didn't even know was lurking in the background, referencing an I.A. Richards or Postman. If people don't, we see all the time when people are stuck in a language game. Somebody uses the word freedom different from me, and we spend 50 minutes arguing over words then. That's not freed speech. You're not able to free your speaking from the particular way you use terms, right? Freed speech is very rare. Freed speech is very, very rare. And that is the problem. The loss of free speech is downstream from the inability to have freed speech. And if we don't deal with that deeper problem, which is going to require people having experiences where they can tell the difference between freed speech and scripted speech, the legal status of our speech will be irrelevant. Okay, you're not going to go to jail, but you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your friends, or you're going to be blacklisted. Well, then who cares if you don't go to jail? Or maybe you don't go to jail and you don't lose your friends, but literally your own mind is incapable of thinking beyond the way you use words. Your words use you more than you use your words. Your ideas use you more than you use ideas. Then you're not freed. But we haven't had that modeled. We've had models of how to be really good at manipulation, or the laws of power, or the laws of love, like those green books or whatever, right? It's like, that's what we've seen. And in a world where that's all people have seen, the discussion about free speech is beside the point, ultimately. It doesn't matter if you have the freedom of speech, if you can't speak freely. And I think we have to reclaim that.
Mm. It links, yeah. I mean, all of this for me is related to trust, and finding someone to be trustworthy. And it's distinct from, not always, but it's largely distinct from the content of what they're saying, and it's more to do with that felt sense of their authenticity in that moment and what they're sharing. And again, not fake authenticity, it's such an overused word, but a real sense that someone is sharing something with me where they have put their defenses down and they're attempting to put words to something they believe or they're thinking through, or it's an attempt or an invitation even for me to understand that person better in that moment. And that is really the priority. And it may be that exactly what I come to understand, it creates a real problem, like there's a real difference there, right? But the I guess the hope I have that I would be able to work with that person and through differences, again, if we keep it small scale here, that we would actually be able to be with those differences and find some way for us to still remain connected, or to be surprised in some new way through that conversation and through that wrestling with the two different kind of perspectives. It's all, for me, it's all about the felt sense that this person is putting their defenses down as much as they can. They are entering into this from a position of, they may still be earnest in that they really want to talk about what they believe in, but there's a humility in that we are here as two equals, and really the biggest intention is for you to understand me, or understand where I'm at right now. And the only way we can do that, the only way, if we again just think about two people, the only way we can do that is to try and both put our defenses down as much as possible. Otherwise, we can't let in that which is being given from the other. We can't. It bumps up against our defenses. It gets distorted by all of these things, or our anxiety, all of this stuff that we've talked about before. That channel of kind of authentic resonance being open, as we've talked about. The extent to which we can be doing that when we're in conversation with someone, and that the other person can be doing the same, that really is for me the predictor of how likely it is that something can come from that. That, like you were saying, Daniel, will be surprising, or and this is just putting words to what we've all already said. There's nothing new in what I'm saying, but it's I do think it also links to this this pace issue, that for people to, the faster we can move information, the more urgency that there is, the more that people are being bombarded, the less likely they'll ever figure out that they have defenses, that there is that there is this authentic resonance they can tune into, that there is a manner in which you can be with another person where you can lay those things down, that it's vulnerable and it can be nerve-wracking and it's humble and it's, but that is the position from which, in my point of view, kind of girdle points can be worked with, or it's not, it's not papering over these things or trying to insist that this part of my map should be torn out and put on yours. And it's almost like, I don't know, I've probably got this wrong, but I almost imagine like this whole girdle point idea, like a hole in the map through which we should fall. Like it's like it's like a I think it goes back to that geometry thing. It's like it's an opportunity to kind of just review the whole structure of things, or it is almost like an opening where like the gestalt can come flying through, or I don't know, there's something about it where it is the point where something truly incredible and surprising can happen. But you cannot I don't want to say elicit it, because I don't want to imply that we're, but it can't happen. I don't know what words to put to it. It can't happen if you come at things from the position of, I guess, authority and an insistence on how this is going to end, on the outcome, and again, nothing new in any of that, but I think trust is something we talk a lot now. There's authenticity is a word that gets thrown around all the time. And I don't really think trust gets enough airtime, because that's really what this is all about. It's like the fabric of all of this is, when I interact with you, what signals am I getting that this is a real person with their defenses down, trying to meet me as best as possible and work towards building something that each of us as individuals wouldn't be able to do. Like what and this is where, obviously the body comes in, because I really do think this is that radar, that ping, that there is a felt sense that can go with it when you're with someone. It's both, it's both picking up on it from the other person, but also being able to know what it's like to feel within yourself, what position you're in. How do you put your defenses down? What even are they? How do you do it? It's both of those components are important. Yeah. Yeah, that's all I'd say.
So I'm thinking I want to bookmark something for Daniel, since I've heard you speak about it. So maybe there's a contrast to make, but the references that you've talked about, the sociologist Philip Rieff, and I think he has a phrase that we live in a therapeutic culture, something like that. And if just by secondhand, by way of you, I take that that's not a positive thing. It's like, this is what's wrong. It's a therapeutic culture. So I want to acknowledge that. But I think what Aspasia was speaking to just now is also a sense where, and I don't like the word therapeutic at all, but there could be, I referred earlier to the idea that there's a cultural nervous system or a collective nervous system, right? And I think that one of the things that's required now is that we simply have an awareness. My body is part of a collective nervous system of everyone in this room right now, or my body is part of the collective nervous system of my family or of my workplace, right? So that I show up at work knowing that I'm dealing with a headache, but I'm also capable of seeing that, oh, she's got a headache. It's just that, but it's like I'm accounting for all of that, rather than just like, well, I cured my headache, I'll just barrel on ahead the way I would otherwise, without noticing how everyone else is doing. I mean, that's putting it kind of crudely, but I think there is a way that we can recognize ourselves to be in a common predicament. And as I think completely understandable as it is to say something like, oh my God, I don't hold political power, I don't have influence. Oh, hell, I guess I'll just have to watch and wait and see what happens. The fact is that when I'm speaking with my friends about this, I am interacting in the culture. And the basic question, I think, is always, well, what shall we do? What shall we do? And what I just said is one of the options. Like one of the options is, well, we should keep scrolling and, see what all of the politicians say and, keep following it and, and then I don't know. Like for example, I hear people talking about people have done this, right? In the last decade in the US. Oh, I'm just going to move to another country. I mean, that's a response. It's taking action, but it's like, but literally, like if we're sitting around and someone's, saw this viral video where the actual moment of his death is, which I didn't watch, I didn't look for it. I know it's out there, but I know a lot of people probably saw it even that didn't intend to see it. But we're sitting with friends, and the question is essentially, what shall we do, right? And I think what you were speaking to, Aspasia, is, if we decide what we should do at the end of this conversation, I think the key question is it because our conversation makes it feel like things are going faster and faster and faster and faster until we said, let's do something? Or is it that the conversation actually moves in such a way that we slowly notice ourselves relaxing and coming into more calm. And then at the end, we say, here's what we'll do, right? I think there can be an acceleration to action and it sounds funny to say it that way, but something like a deceleration to action, or a riot, like, and it takes me again to this phrase, that this distinction, which I love, between confidence and certainty, right? When I speed up, it's because I want to be certain about everything. And as you said, Daniel, the problem with my map is always that I don't have your map in my map. And so, but I think what we do with the certainty, and you've pointed to this very specific certainty, the certainty that I am good and you are evil, or that we are good and they are evil, right? This is a certainty, but it's a certainty that almost requires speed, because I'm not certain if everyone else is going to agree when I say who's good and who's evil. So let's get this over with quick, or let's get people on our, let's get the people we need under the banner of our good, and then let's, before they leave, let's take action now. And that can be a kind of a speeding up, right? I was listening to you say free speech and freed speech. And what came to my mind was the title of a book by a well-loved meditation teacher from the UK named Rob Berbea. It's possible you may have heard of him. He innovated by really bringing in imagination. In fact, he really draws on like Jung and Hillman a fair amount. Very interesting. But and one of the things he does is he comes up through Buddhist tradition. He teaches the Four Noble Truths, and at a certain point, he said, and I can't remember what his condition was, but he died young, and he knew he was dying, and he was speaking about his oncoming death all these years. But at a certain point, he sort of said, well, you could look at this as the avoidance of suffering, but meditation could also be a way to experience more beauty, and that's what I'm interested in. And he started creating all these practices around. Like one of my favorite practices he has is, people know the practice of loving kindness, where I pick a person and I send them well wishes of loving kindness. And, he had taught this. But one of his meditations invites you to treat all phenomena as the direction. So like if someone coughs, the cough warms your heart, is the invitation, and everything. And like, you walk outside and like a car drives by, love for the car. I mean, the car, including the car, not just the driver, but the hunk of metal, like love to that hunk of metal. So anyway, the title of his book is, and this was the connection with free speech, the title of his book is Seeing That Frees. And so he's talking about perception, and he's saying you can develop your perception in such a way that it frees you. It frees you. And part of it is because you simply, like metta, the act of loving kindness, I might not love everything all the time, but I can cultivate the feeling of love. And, it might happen spontaneously, at my child's wedding or something like this, and I'm just filled with it. But in that moment, I literally see something different, right? And so this is the whole point of the loving kindness practices. We're just going to do that again and again so that we're used to that feeling. And we realize, even if someone says that we generated it in an artificial manner, we've spent time looking through those eyes, right? And so the way I'd like to bring this along is like, can we also think of speech that frees, right? And I think that's when we're sitting with our friends, and it's partly just being really clear with my friend that it's okay to just share what's on your mind, what's on your heart. I'm your friend, and if I disagree, the first principle is you're my friend. So I'll right. Like work it out, or we'll explore it together. But it's this kind of conversation, which I think is, you're saying, Daniel, this is the actual conversation that many people have never had. It's like, oh shit, you and I really do have different positions on this. And that's a shame, because we've been friends for a long time. And it's like for some people, the idea that the relationship could last after this conversation gets thrown out pretty quickly. It's like, what? You said XYZ, you know? So, but I think so this is the way I would refer to the therapeutic culture. And again, I don't want to use that term, but I think we could take responsibility for the collective nervous system just in the way that, again, is speech violence? Well, there are arguments that it can be violence, but can speech itself also be care? Can it be the creation of more space for the person I'm speaking with? You know, just the fact that they tell me something and I can tell that it's kind of hard for them to say it out loud and they're not sure, you know, and I can just reassure them that, like, yeah, I'm here to listen. You know, that is very simple, but this is the kind of thing right now that I think could really make a big difference. And, you know, then people will remember, oh, that was the person that listened to me after Charlie Kirk was killed. Or, you know, there's another piece of this. If you don't mind, I just bring in one more thing, which I'm astonished and haven't quite, I feel like I need to go back but Erica Kirk stood on the stage at the memorial and said, I forgive the killer. And I saw the headlines, so then I went to read. And in the article, it says she also, at some point, was asked, do you want the death penalty? And she said, I'm leaving that to the government. Don't ask me, right? Don't want to touch that. But then I had to watch the video, and I'm very aware now, like, here's me, like, checking out the viral video. But I saw people, and the article said people stood on their feet in applause. And I saw in the shot, there was a couple people looked like very authentic tears streaming down their face when she said that. And of course, the president said something that all the headlines point out was essentially the exact opposite of that. But the article also, you know, in one of those pundit moments, there was a line in the article, she might be a future star. You know, like I mean, everyone's talking about how poised she is, which is very true, right? She's sitting there wiping her eyes, but she is really giving a speech, you know, while she did it. And of course, people can jump to all kinds of conclusions or try to say, well, she did that for this, that, and the other reason. But if you come to it from I mean, this is literally what we talked about in our last conversation on forgiveness, these cases of a parent, you know, forgiving the murder of the child. So this woman, you know, on national television, internationally, you know, I mean, that's a huge moment. And I don't know how much it will stay in the zeitgeist or not, but I mean, I feel like everyone I know, I want to ask them what they think about that. Just, I mean, that's a conversation starter right there, what she did.
Yeah, I watched that whole thing. And I teared up when she said it. And I noticed the same thing. I noticed people in the crowd that were crying. Yeah, and I would be lying if I didn't say that what ran through my mind in that moment as well was, this is what we just spoke about in the last conversation. Just, wow, how strange. I don't know. I'm still percolating around all of that. There's also something about the way that, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but just the way that the coverage kind of got turned into the comparison between that Erica forgave him versus Trump then came out and said that he doesn't and he wants, you know, revenge, and like, but presented like as though that's a big problem, or I don't know. So they've got a different opinion on it. I don't really understand why I don't really understand the point that's trying to be made. It's almost like, I think there was a power to the way that she was talking about it that could be diluted or kind of glazed over by pointing to the fact that Trump then came out and said the opposite or something. I didn't understand the necessity to point out. Yeah, I just didn't really understand what the point of that was. It kind of just took away from what I think what she was doing. He has his own agenda and he's doing his, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. Anyway, seemed to just generate noise over the top of what was otherwise seemed to be, to me, quite an authentic and powerful moment from the person who was closest to the person who was murdered. So, you know, yeah, I really don't have anything to add there. And if anyone else does.
Well, he had no business speaking after her, and if he was a gentleman, he would have assured she spoke last instead of him, but he's too egotistical.
Agreed.
I don't have many nice things to say about Trump
No.
at this point. I am, and what's very disturbing, is we had Miller talking, we had all of these people. If you have, because they can just weaponize it and say we're the moral high ground at with their hatred, and you take the return of the knowledge of good and evil and actually create hell with it. So this would actually, I would have to get into it, but he should not have spoken after her, and it was a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, I
And
couldn't
in
believe
fact,
that as well. I couldn't believe
and in fact, I think Erica should basically, well, it was a bit ridiculous. Anyway, so first off, maps are defenses, and maps are indestructible. And so if people put up their defenses, they are indestructible. I think we've had the idea of no, everyone put up their defenses and we'll compete, and the weaker defenses will lose, and then we'll win, and that's how things ought to be.
Mm.
Well, if you take seriously that maps are internally consistent and that defenses are indestructible, then if people put up their defenses, it's game over, actually. Defenses are final. I think a lot of people are like, what's wrong with defenses? People can put up their defenses and people will have conflict. People romanticize conflict, actually. They create a certain romanticizing, like the best will win and it will rise to the top. Not if you're dealing with indestructible maps, they won't. And in fact, all you will get is no progress whatsoever. You want to have, the competition needs to be in the girdle point, not in the consistency of maps, because the competition, in a sense, needs to be in the place of vulnerability. Which is a very different kind of competition, because it is a competition that is actually trying to maintain the work of what is the best way between our experiences of Gestalt that we can determine for the insight of Gestalt, for the experience of Gestalt. And actually what you were saying on this idea, this is very, very important. The girdle point is the possibility of Gestalt. It is the possibility of higher geometry, because another way to put it is if maps are basically, if you grant it horizontal, then the only way you're going to get a different geometry is going to be actually adding a new dimensionality to it. And now you've opened a new space. Now it has different motions. It can move in different ways. And actually, too, with that hole, you could theoretically bring new geometries where you could make different shapes. And you could have it move in different ways. So if maps have girdle points, then they actually are afforded different geometrical forms. And ones that I don't think there's a real sense in which thought, in a way, hasn't even begun in history, because thought for most of history has simply been in service of map making and consistency. The thinking begins when it actually encounters the girdle point, and it actually is trying to think. It is because the girdle point is also the experience of the territory, of which you can't experience without being overwhelmed, and yet you can experience that overwhelm in a manner where you develop with it, as opposed to be destroyed by it, right? Well, that's an unfolding. That's a movement. So that, I think, is very important. I think also it should be noted that when Reef is talking about the therapeutic culture, he is a Freud scholar, and Freud, toward the end of his life, like the early Freud, basically suggests the unleashing of the pleasure principle is how you can have the authentic individual and overcome various psychosis, et cetera, so forth. But the later Freud, when he becomes much more of a sociologist, is kind of like, well, actually, if you get rid of the reality principle and it's all pleasure principle, this is people are overwhelmed by their pleasure, they're overwhelmed by freedom, and they become prone to totalitarianism and nihilism and all of that. The language that Reef uses is releases and constraint. The idea of we are in the 60s in an age where what will solve our problems is releases. We need to release people. And he was like, no, that doesn't work because people are overwhelmed by those releases. They actually need constraints. Belonging again will say that Philip Reeve should have called it givens. We don't experience our constraints as constraints. They're givens. Christianity is given. It's not a constraint. It's just the nature of reality. And what ends up happening if people are freed from that interpretation, then they get their release. They are not forced to understand things as a Christian, but that runs the risk of overwhelming them with possibility. They don't know how to understand actions. There's no givens, and we get sort of problems. So the idea that Reeve is getting at is by therapeutic, he's referring to the philosophy of the removal of the reality principle in favor of the pleasure principle or the removal of givens for releases. And I think, in all honesty, I think that's important what you're getting at. Now, in terms of maps, people have actually found a kind of, people find a certain release in avoiding the girdle point. You could associate the girdle point with the reality principle and the consistency with the pleasure principle. I think we see this today. All of these videos on, destroying our opponent, or why is it there's such an interest in people like Charlie Kirk or these different, because there's actually a pleasure in seeing the people you disagree with destroyed, right? That it's the logos pleasure principle, you could say, that the internet has unleashed, which perhaps was not really unleashed until the internet. This idea of the pleasure principle being tied to education in this way, right? But it's a kind of education that is tied to a certain defeating your opponent. Because who is your opponent? Your constraint. If your opponent has a good point, that's a constraint on your worldview, right? But if your opponent is an idiot or evil or wrong, then your worldview is pure release. There's nothing holding it back, right? So what ends up happening is there is a pleasure people get in feeling like their worldview is indestructible and consistent. And it is, unfortunately, at this age in history, that the most powerful worldviews are, in fact, internally consistent, and they are, in fact, indestructible. And there's a radical pleasure people can get in just dwelling in that, because they're not vulnerable and they don't have to be destroyed. And there's an entire industry that develops, and a political industry that develops by giving people the pleasure of their map and consistency. And so we are, in a sense, a logos therapeutic culture in that sort of way that Reeve is talking about. And the reality principle would be the girdle point, which is the fact that the map is not the reality is the worldview is not the world. The map is not the territory. And we can all say we know that, but as long as I never have to actually encounter the other to really make me feel that, then even though I technically know the map is not the territory, practically I don't in my body. And as Hegel pointed, and as I would associate with Hegel, reality is not the technical, but the practical. We tend to say what's practical is not as true as what's technically true. No, it's the exact opposite. What we practically live is more real than what we technically know is the case. The fact we technically know the map is not the territory, that actually just makes us feel like we know better as we practically live as if they're the same thing. And that's a major problem. And so the girdle point is the reality principle. And the reality is that your map is just a map. It does not entail other people's maps. And actually, the world, there's a lot that you don't know that the encounter of the other is necessary for you to be surprised by that knowledge, to be surprised by all of that. But that requires trust. If you don't have to, well, another thing I was going to say, in the same way, if people have never experienced freed speech, or they've never experienced euopeia, they've never experienced a real conversation, therefore don't know what they're missing. There's a way in which if people have not experienced the beauty that trust affords or the friendship that trust affords, why should they want it? What's the value of trust? Yeah, because most people have no trouble trusting people like them. Nobody has trouble trusting. Like, trust is a problem in pluralism, right? Trust is not as big of a problem when you're dealing with people like you or people that you agree with. Now, it's funny because when you get in family and intimate relations and you have constant proximity, then the issue of trust emerges. But this is actually where the internet is so dangerous. Because there's dangers to all these things. The internet allows you to meet people who are like you that you're not in proximity to. So then it's easier to have a kind of simulacra of a relationship that actually makes you feel like relationship without trust is possible. because I'm actually able to kind of get along with people in a manner that makes it seem like trust is there, but it's not the same kind of trust that has to develop if you're seeing the person day in and day out and they say things that offend you and yet you stick with them nevertheless. Because trust becomes most meaningful when you have to trust through something. As this person is hurting you, you say, nevertheless, I'm going to trust through this pain. Like trust is meaningful when rationality tells you to exit. Like when it's rational to leave, that's when the meaning of trust comes in, right? Like because trust sustains you in that, right? Like you say, I'm feeling pain, I don't like this, but this is my friend, or this is the person I committed to, or actually, I know this pain is good for me. I'm going to trust this pain. So trust is what gets you through the feeling of exit, right? But if you don't believe that there's anything on the other side of the pain, if you've never experienced the kind of character or quality of interaction or beauty that could be across from that, I don't care if we don't have trust. I don't care if society doesn't have trust. I don't need to trust the guy next to me to take down the bad guy. I don't need to trust my fellow, conservative or my fellow liberal. We both agree that conservatives are evil or liberals are evil. We don't need trust. We just need agreement on that. Because there's a way in which agreement replaces trust. Like agreement on who is the enemy or what is the problem, that can kind of create an effect of trust without trust actually being there. That's why when people win the revolution the next day, they eat themselves. Because they felt like they had a brothership. They felt like they had trust. But then actually when they get on the side and they're sitting across from them and they have to make decisions and whatever, all the backstabbing comes in, right? So trust becomes most pronounced precisely in difficulty. Precisely in the hardship that you're going to trust through. But if people have not had the experiences of what trust can afford, then they don't know they're missing anything. And that's why it becomes really important for the culture to provide places where people or stages of practice or churches or communities or friendships where people can actually see what trust makes possible and what can be on the other side of it. If they don't have those experiences, they're not going to do it. And I am more and more, I know we've spoke about it before, but, the hikikomori in Japan, which are these people that never leave their apartment, that is growing around the entire world. That is spreading around the world. That is a social condition of people that are never leaving their apartment. Because what ends up, and because the thing is with the hikikomori, a lot of them are basically like, it's rational not to leave your apartment. What do relations give me other than pain and hurt? I can order food in my apartment. I can use the internet to get pleasure. I've got pornography. I've got interaction. I've got entertainment. Why would I ever leave my apartment? And let me put it this way. If we as a culture can't really show what relationships afford, if all anyone ever sees is fighting or political division or whatever, then the hikikomori have a point. It seems pretty rational never to leave your apartment. That's why we're seeing this phenomenon grow in Europe and America of people that are basically never leaving their home. Because rationality without non-rationality encloses. It goes in of itself. Hikikomoris are just kind of the logical end of autonomous rationality in a world that isn't able to convince people to give non-rational things a go, like trust and encountering otherness and things like that. And then if people never leave their apartment per se, or they never go offline to encounter real people, the collective nervous system isn't trained. So then if they do go out, they're overwhelmed or it goes badly and they say, yep, I knew it. I should have never left my apartment. Yep, I knew it. I should have never talked with conservatives. Yes, I knew it. I should have never talked with atheists. I should have never talked with the other. I knew it. All it ever does is go wrong. And then they're especially sealed in their apartment. They're especially sealed in their enclosure. And so it becomes incredibly important for people to train the collective nervous system. But we as a culture have to provide that. We can't just tell people, hey, go do democracy. Hey, go do free speech. Hey, go talk with people you disagree with. Hey, let's lower the temperature. After Charlie Kirk, everything's kind of going up. Let's lower the temperature. People can't lower the temperature. The only way you lower your temperature is to have control of your nervous system. People's nervous systems are crazy. Let me put it this way. There's a lot of talk right now to lower the temperature. That stuff's getting extreme. The only way you can lower the temperature in a world that doesn't have the resources to train people's nervous systems, to learn them to free speech, is for them to become hikikomori, is for them to go to their apartment and not to leave. That's the only way to do it. And that's life of the pod, as Raymond would say. That's the matrix. That's where you put everyone in those different tubes. That is what's happening. And so, I've been more and more, I won't go into detail here now, thinking of the dialectic between the Amos fetimization and the growing Hikikomori thing that's going on. Those things go together. Now, I could say more on my perspectives on Miss Kirk in the context of that memorial service, because I think that will get into the nuances of the ultimate topic of forgiveness and actually the dangers of forgiveness in the context of if you have one person that forgives, okay, who's giving back the knowledge of good and evil, and notice how quickly people do in fact cynically say, well, he's just doing that as scripts, he's just cynically doing that, that's internally consistent systems. That's the age of maps where people just boom, just like that. That all aside, if you have someone that gives back the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, but everyone else in their group does not, then they can use that individual actually to supercharge their anger and rage. Everyone has to do it. Everyone has to be part of it. Because then you go, wow, such a moral person has been made to suffer this. The liberals really must be bad. They really must be stopped. If someone of that caliber would actually do that, then, have this happen to them, then we really gotta be terrible. And also, the other thing that I would say is I do think forgiveness has to be in the body. It has to move into the body. If you have all of these people who are Republican saying, okay, and I don't know what people are doing, but if all these people say, well, if Miss Kirk forgives, we'll forgive as well, but in their body, they get angry when they hear a liberal speak, then they don't forgive. It has to be in the body. When Jesus forgives, he suffers on the cross. It's body. Forgiveness is bodily. It's in the body. The body has to forgive. You can't just in your mind forgive if your body doesn't. And also, we have to forgive together, or people are going to weaponize the forgiveness to their own ends. And, you get someone like Trump who's saying, I hate my enemies, but then he's going to be able to hate his enemies in defense of someone like like a Miss Kirk. Well, then that just supercharges their hatred, right? So it is a very dangerous thing. And that's why the topic of forgiveness has to be thought throughout, precisely because it is the most powerful thing. It is the return of the knowledge of good and evil. The most powerful things, if usurped by the wrong ends, becomes the worst of things, actually. It's like the death of God, it becomes the worst of things or the best of things, right? Like if people politicize forgiveness for their own ends, then you have a super destructive force. Now, that's opening a lot there. That gets into why the topic of forgiveness is such a massive one, because it is the ethical issue that is the girdle point. And when you unveil forgiveness, that's why you see these strong hatred reactions. Like forgiveness brings out the worst in people or the best of people. Just like that. It's either this incredible beauty or this incredible injustice. People are not lukewarm about forgiveness. It's very interesting. People are not lukewarm about forgiveness. It either really makes them mad or they really are overwhelmed with the beauty of it, right? Well, that's precisely the activity of a girdle point. That's precisely calling people to what will you do? And I think this is my point. The very fact that as soon as he says that the first Trump is going to say is basically undercut it, means that she was offering a gift to people that weren't worthy of it, frankly, who weren't able to handle it and are immediately pushing it under the rug. That is exactly the opposite of what we need right now. And so I could say more. I will stop. There is a lot to be said on that topic, though, but I'll stop.
There is the point before we got to the forgiveness here.
Hikikomori, everyone kind of withdrawing.
The kind of physical isolation and these online relationships that people can have instead. This is where I think too, again, the being able to be with our emotions, given that emotions happen in our body, is so key, because part of being in physical proximity with someone is also our body's awareness that that bodily harm can be done to us in that moment, right? That's not the same as when I'm on a Zoom call with you guys. You know, there's other kinds of injury that can happen, but I can always just, you know, put my screen down and walk off. When you are close enough to another person that your body knows that they could reach out and physically attack you, that's already a different context. And this is one of the places where I really do believe that gender is important. And, you know, there is a particular experience, I think, for women living throughout their lives being, you know, when they are again, broadly speaking, but when they're in interactions with a man, there is a kind of physical difference that is, I believe, and most women that I've spoken to, our body knows that. And it's at a very physiological level. And I do think there's a particular guardedness that we can take. Now, it's probably the same kind of thing if you're a guy and you are in the presence of a guy who's much bigger than you, right? But it's not even just physical size and muscle strength, it's also a sexual difference. And so I do think these things matter and we don't talk about them enough. And unfortunately, there was a way in which some of this got turned into a type of feminism that I really just can't stand, and I think has become like a cancer. But there are important aspects to it that I do think matter. And then what branches off from that, I believe, is also how can we be with those feelings? So as an example, how can we as women notice our own emotional response to being aware of the other person's gender? Like it's not a pretend. I really do believe we know that when we're with someone. I think it's silly to suggest we don't. How do we integrate our own like just sort of base levels of, as an example, anger or rage that in this dynamic with this person, they could always outmuscle me, always, right? Like, and I do think that there are just some basic getting to ground level of trying to understand our own emotional landscape and what happens when we're in particular dynamics, that unless we can really unravel it, notice that it lives there, integrate it in who we are, not be afraid of it, not try to cover it up, that it causes all sorts of issues. And this leads to all these defenses that we're talking about. Now that's about like women, but then there's also a manner in which I think we have gone about as a society to monsterize, I guess, some of the anger in men as well in unique ways. And so like when I think about people just choosing to live in a little apartment, never go outside, they can get everything they want online. If I'm thinking as well about men who are doing that, I'm just thinking about their own kind of being neutered. They've kind of just neutered their connection to very vital emotional aspects of their being and their body. There's a fear to really be in physical proximity to another person. Now, if it's a woman, if it's a man, they might be slightly different things. But I think that a lot of that is about what it generates inside. It is this physiological process. So that's a bit scattered, what I just laid out there. But when we start to talk about isolation and relationships becoming online relationships versus truly being with another person, I start to see again the important role of how honest we can be about our own emotional landscape and what is it that happens for each of us when we are physically with a person versus behind a screen with a person. And that just, I don't know how to put it into words. That for me just sort of broadens the base. Like it just broadens my understanding. I guess it enhances my map. Like it gives me, I find it fascinating that I can always tune into more information. inside me, if I put it in those terms. I don't see it as this kind of scary thing.
Right.
And I don't, I just think trying to cultivate why that matters for others is just, it's confusing. It's confusing. I'll leave it there. Otherwise, I'm going to get very scattered. There was some stuff there around the forgiveness that is very alive for me as well, but I might bring that in later.
Well, I put out a video recently after Charlie Kirk was killed, and I didn't really prepare it. And I mean, it's funny, to the question of content creation, when I thought to make the video, I had a second thought, should I stop and like make some notes? But I think that was like, and then I thought it'd be better if I don't do that, because then I'm going to start to try to calculate how, the whole thing lands or whatever. Like at the beginning of this conversation, when we were talking about the pacing and, what's the frame I'm speaking in? Like we can just notice it for ourselves now. Oh, there's a YouTube audience, right? Like suddenly you notice your bodies. It's not unlike, it's a different version, but it's like, oh, I'm in the room with the other gender, or that's my boss, like. So, but the funny thing with the internet is it's projected. I have no idea who's actually going to watch this video, right? Like, I mean, I know some people and our friends or whatever, but anyway, there was some different responses, and the video was essentially what I said was I was trying to speak to what we're talking about here, that no matter what you see, someone else will see it differently, and that's fine. But just kind of a nod to what Daniel's saying, please include in your map that other people have different maps. And then if you do that, what might be a logical way to work with that? And I put some other thoughts together, but one of the things, some of the responses, I mean, I got different, people appreciated the video, but, there were certain objections to it. Like one of the objections is, this is a beautiful idea, but, those people are really spreading hate. So I think what you're saying applies to you and I, but for those people, it doesn't really work. Or another one was, and this one really got me, and I'm really thinking about is, oh yes, that's a beautiful thing, and I live by that, except that it never works. It never works. I try to listen, I try to understand everyone, but it never works. And I mean, I think this gets into the conversation with Javier about what's realistic or not. But what I saw, at least in one of the responses, was a person who I think genuinely has been living his life trying to do this, and he's really discouraged, right? He's, I mean, this is internet dialogue, so I don't want to make too many assumptions. And then another person, and I went and some of these guys had videos. So the interesting thing is then I went and watched their channel, and they had each spoken on. And so then there was a conservative guy who basically said, I see what you're saying, but a bunch of people celebrated Charlie Kirk, and I happen to agree with a lot of what he said. So I guess those people basically wouldn't be unhappy to see me dead. And I thought, well, that's a pretty logical conclusion that you've drawn there. I mean, I understand why you'd feel that way, right? And I went and I watched on his channel a couple of things, and he had a video from a couple of years back where some of the, actually, he pointed to Ronald Reagan's son, and I don't know if Ronald Reagan's son is a Democrat or a Republican, but he was talking about a news clip where Ronald Reagan's son was talking about so-called low information voters. And he was saying, oh, I guess I'm a low information voter because I didn't go to college, but you know what? I do read the newspaper. I do watch I get a lot of information. And he was just very, clearly talking about what's it like to be labeled a low information voter, and I think a lot of people haven't really had the experience of being labeled that. They've had the experience of reading articles horrified that these low information voters are out there making poor decisions, so I think a lot of this, so one of the things that was great about making the video was to see those responses and find myself on a little YouTube channel. I think there was 50 views for that video that I just described. But Well, so there's one other thing that I just had earlier this week, and I thought, well, I want to bring this in, but I think like the other things, it's kind of sitting there in the air right now. And this is the question of prayer. And I'll speak personally to it. And what could be interesting is, you know, my parents essentially raised us atheists. And I really, as a young person at different points, had a complete certainty that religious people were crazy people. Just pretty simple. And I had a lot of evidence because I'd seen the televangelists and I'd heard my parents talk about the televangelists. But I also had my best friend went to church, you know, with his family. And I went with them once and I just didn't get it. Maybe I thought it was boring. But like, I don't think, anyway, I had this very unexamined belief about religion, right? Years later, because of the crazy twists and turns of my life, I find myself working in factories with coworkers who are immigrants, and everyone believes in God. Just everyone believes in God, right? And I was like, oh, these people are really great people. Like, you know, like we had all these great times, and then it was like, you know, and you know, Jesucristo, you know, like it's just that was, you know, the reference point all the time. So I had a lived experience of moving through that. But I had a sort of, you know, for my own navigation of the world, for my own map, there's no guy up in the sky who's going to help me. Come on, you know, that's crazy. But, you know, I'm a young person, I'm all fucked up and you have to deal with all kinds of shit. So eventually in college, I find meditation, Buddhism. I also remember taking a class, you know, a college course on Judaism and being fascinated reading about the people who really followed the Kabbalah kind of road and the mystical. And I'm just like, wow, this is like really interesting. This is really different. But for whatever reason, I think like a lot of people today, the so-called spiritual but non-religious, what many of us find ourselves in is meditation, right? And meditation, very good thing for your nervous system. Meditation also is a way of stepping into the girdle point, just like let me close my eyes and breathe and not do anything else. And let's see what arises. Like that's really different than following the directions or doing my homework. You know, it's like, so it's an opening. And then at a certain point, as you know, I'm interacting with different people, including like John Vervaeke had a meditation course. And one of the things that he spoke to was, well, you know, meditation isn't, he likes to say, it isn't just a vacation. It's you know, you're doing something and you're modeling something for yourself that you want to bring into the world. So one of his suggestions is when you finish meditating, you say out loud a series of things. He sort of he had a source in Buddhist practice, and then he said you could modernize it. But basically, you sort of speak to your principles, right? And at a certain point, I was doing that. I took on, oh, John Vervaeke had this idea, let me finish meditating and say something. And I also had a day where I was really in bad shape, just like life isn't going well. And I got to the end. And the thing that was also happening is just that I'm in meditation and now I am speaking. Who am I speaking to? Yeah. What's going on here, right? And on that particular day, I felt really bad and I didn't know what I needed or what, but I kind of, the word please came out of my mouth and I said it twice, like, please, please. And then I literally said to myself, who are you talking to, dude? You know, like, and it was like, it was too late. It had already happened and my whole body changed. And it was like, that was my first understanding of God, prayer as something that's metaphysically real to me. Still doesn't make sense that, you know, the story of the Bible, all those stories, but like there was a presence that it was like, I like to say, it was as if I was leaning on the air and expecting to be caught. That's how it kind of felt. And there was this release precisely because the way I described it later is I let go of my disbelief. So it's not like I arrived into a clear belief of what, but I had this disbelief that there's no one there to talk to. And then I'm talking to them. What's going on here, right? And then so that's many years ago. But just this week, I was meditating, and let's just say I've developed further my relationship to the Word God. Let's just call it my relationship to the Word God. And I think the word God is what I like about it is people relate to the word, right? And of course, a lot of people will have a map of that word, but it's also the word God. Most of the maps are like, all powerful or all see. I mean, it's pretty incomprehensible, even if you've got it mapped out.
Yep.
Who God is or what God is or how God works or any of that. And what I noticed, so I had I've been doing a practice. I won't describe the whole thing. I wrote an article on Substack just now, which actually describes the meditation practice that I've been doing, which uses the chakras. And it's someone gave me an idea, I changed it. So I'm like making up my own thing as I go along, trying to map it onto my life. But it's a practice now. It's not, And this particular day earlier in the week, I sort of invited myself more directly to make it prayer. And I'm like, I don't know how to pray. How do you do that? And it's really interesting. I've heard people tell stories. I'm sure Daniel has some stories. Maybe Aspasia, you have stories as well. Like parents tell their kids. Like Bonita Roy talks about her mother says, "Now tell God that you're sorry that you hit your sister." And that's kind of like people have all kinds of stories like this, But the point is, when I start praying, who's to say what I'm doing? I mean, similar problem with meditation. How do you teach meditation? Like the meditation teacher tells you something, but then it's like, off you go. Let's see how you do, right? You come back at the end and you compare notes. But there's a couple more things. So I'm going to go on for a bit. So I appreciate you listening. The most beautiful. So I mentioned Robert Bea earlier, the meditation teacher. So he tells a story about Mother Teresa, which I later looked up and verified. But she was once interviewed, and I think one of the things that she did, this is another thing, is I think she said at one point, every single face I look into is the face of Jesus, right? She just sort of, I think she made that real for herself. I think she really made it embodied, right? And that would make sense. How else do you become Mother Teresa? But she was asked in an interview once about what happens when you pray. And what do you say? The question was, what do you say? What do you say to God when you pray? And she said, "Oh, I don't say anything. I just listen." Mm-hmm. And then, well, what does God say? And she said, "He doesn't say anything. He just listens." And then she said, "If you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you." But I sort of had that. I mean, I love that story. And this week I was sort of, in a sense, praying. And one of the things that came to me was just like, show me how to receive you, right? Because I don't even know how is that. Please show me how to receive. And what I noticed was, if I wanted to like give a sort of an apologetic, like an atheist apologetic, I wasn't really praying. Let me tell you what really happened. What I could say is, but I really invited this, so I think it was authentic. But in any case, if I say I want to talk to God right now, and really I'm just sitting in this room, and it's just me here, how do I make that real? Well, I say something to God, and then a bird flies by the window. Was that God? I say something to God, and then I feel discomfort in my belly. Is that God? And then I have a thought in my head. Now that's a series of words. Was that God speaking? And I played with this later. So I was journaling about it, so I don't remember the particular thoughts in my head. But as I was journaling, I thought, well, what if God says, jump out the window? And then it's like, okay, God, that couldn't be God. But then it's like, wait a minute. Do you know how to listen to God? Could it be that there's something that you are afraid to do and you think it's as crazy as jumping out the window, and God is saying, you'll be fine? I mean, the point is, you could interpret, but the thing that really got me is, how am I going to know I've interpreted right or wrong? And I mean, if it's anything that's very prophetic, like what should I do? What should I tell my boss. I mean, whatever. But I mean, if I make it very concrete, I suppose I can test it in the world. But just in my experience of feeling that I was authentically doing something that wasn't meditating and something that was valuable and might help direct my compass through my life, it was like, well, I have to have more presence than I ever, like, I'm talking to God right now, pay the fucking attention, right? And my attention just became like, boom, really? Okay.
Yeah.
The bird flew by. Was that just a bird flying? Like, whatever it is. And of course, while the bird flies by, the sensation is happening in my belly, the thought, there's many things going on. So the other thing is, if a thought appears in my head, yes, but also there was an ambulance siren going down the street. Like, what's the message? Right. So it's, and it's the Gestalt, right? And it's my, and so to me, that's a place where, you know, if we want to bring it back, I mean, I think in, you know, times of trouble, what do? Mother Mary comes to me, right? I mean, this is also a moment for prayer, I think, for many people. And yet, what is prayer? Each person may see that differently, but I think that's another potential aspect of the girdle point right now is something like prayer. And that's something that's also has a potential universality in it. If you can accept that no one can tell anyone else how to pray. I mean, that might be a lot for some people to swallow, but I think that's another thing that it's just been really on my mind, and so sharing it with you.
That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about prayer too. It's really not a whole lot I could add to that, Seth, but yeah, it's something I have done since I can remember, and I really don't know why. There's lots of reasons not to. It wasn't something that was, you know, happening in my family per se. But it's kind of a no, the words aren't right. It's kind of like a form of relationship or something. But you know how mindfulness is like a stance that you take? It's like kind of it's an attentional stance. You know, I see prayer as kind of like that's like and you were describing it so beautifully there, Seth. It's like a mode almost that you enter into, and the manner in which you are paying attention shifts. But for me, it really does feel like that is given to me. Like that is not, it's not something I sort of calculate and decide to do. It's like I have to completely, when we're talking about putting defenses down, there's something about it that's almost like the ultimate form of defenses down, perhaps defenses even against the idea that I'm the only person here in this moment, or I don't know. And there is a presence to it. And I've sort of always associated, and again, this is not to say this is what it's going to be like for other people, but I've always associated a sort of, well, prayer as coming with, I don't know how to explain it. It's almost like a force, like I almost feel like a nudging, or like it's not so much involved with words. There is something else to it as well that is very much like a presence. And yeah, I think anything I'm going to add now is not really going to add anything particularly helpful to the conversation. But I'm just really glad you raised it, because it's a really important topic, and something that I'm just seeing is getting much more airtime, I guess is one way of thinking about it. Like people are discussing it more in places where I've never seen such things discussed, and something that for many people has been quite a private thing. People are kind of, the circles I run in anyway, being much more vulnerable and willing to share their interest in it, or that they do pray, or what is it, you know. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, and I completely, Seth, beautiful. Prayer is always something that's been very, very fascinating to me on what exactly is it. what exactly is going on. There are a number of books. Philip Yancey has a book on what is prayer, Bonhoeffer, et cetera, so forth. But it's very interesting that after all of these years of theology on prayer, there actually is almost still a mystery about it. And you would think by now there wouldn't be, right? But actually, I would argue there very much is. When Jesus talks about prayer, he says, go into your room and shut the door. But people pray publicly. Should they pray publicly? Jesus also gives an instruction for prayer. If we're just staying with Christianity, he's like, pray this. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive those who trespass against us as we forgive them who trespass against us. And deliver us from evil. It actually ends there. It actually ends on deliver us from evil. It doesn't go for thine is the kingdom and the power and glory forever. It's
Oh,
just that people
really?
later
I
on
did not
added
know
that. Yeah,
that.
just in the prayer just ends on and deliver us from evil. It kind of ends on a very ominous note, actually, when Jesus gives it, and it was only later added, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. But it's very interesting that Jesus gives, like, do this. Now, of course, people have argued and said, well, that's just kind of a blueprint of what you do. That's not literally what you are supposed to do. But then it's also interesting that you're supposed to do that prayer in solitude, right? Don't be like the Pharisees who are performing prayer and want to be seen as praying well. So there's many things on that to touch on. I do think God is a kind of girdle point. Actually, I think theology ended up being designed like the perfect epistemological system. That's one of the reasons it worked. Like God is a girdle point. And it's interesting, a play on this is that the name girdle has God in it and actually has L as well. God, and L in Hebrew is God. So it is an apophatic point. And it is very important that you can use the name God and speak across pluralism. That's very interesting. And that's one of the reasons why throwing away God is probably not wise, because there are very few terms that everyone has to acknowledge is an opening. Because even if you're a Christian, you have to say, well, God is transcendent in my understanding. So even though I think I know what God is, there is always a certain excess, which maybe I should listen to the Muslim then. And the Muslim has to go, yes, God is transcendent. There's this idea that no matter how airtight your system is, God is always an excess. And that excess does, in fact, open pluralistic possibility. It certainly restricts judgment, because a huge thing that religious traditions usually are is like judgment, loving your neighbor. Like, how do you love? Like, here's another idea. How do you love your neighbor or love your enemy without belief in an excess? Because the excess means that your understanding of your enemy may be wrong, right? There's an excess to your category, right? So it's not by chance, like loving your enemy and also believing in God, of which means you're also oriented to that which is beyond your understanding, then those kind of match up, because you almost have to, in order to love your enemy and truly do it, believe that there might be more than what you think. Which, if you don't believe in God, you're not trained into that habit. That's not even like really something you embody or day in and day out work on, right? Like a lot of the great ethical teachings are in a way saying there's more going on than you think, right? There's like more going on than you think. Don't judge, be slow to judge. But that it makes sense that goes with a belief in God, because God itself is a certain sort of, but there's more. But there's more. Like all ethics require you to have a certain willingness to accept there's something beyond your understanding, right? Or your take on the situation. Or even if this person did something terrible, you don't know what the future may hold. You don't know that they could change, right? It is very difficult to have genuine ethics without a girdle point, rather it be God or the map is not the territory, because then there's nothing beyond your impression, really. Your impression is final, and ethics is always compelling you to go beyond your impression. But you have no way of life that habituates you to genuinely doing that. You're not reminded every day that God knows more than you, or that God is all powerful, he's in control. So it becomes very difficult to sustain an ethics that is compelling you to practically live as if there's something beyond your understanding, right? And like basically my suggestion here is that ethics is almost always a certain sort of belief that there's more going on than you think, that you shouldn't close, right? You shouldn't close down, right? Well, you shouldn't, but that becomes very difficult to do without a girdle point. And many, look, Not all people that go to church, God has basically become a part of the consistency now. God is not for all people the girdle point, even if they say there's he's been brought into the consistency. And this is where a loss of the mystical traditions or the theological conversation has been very consequential to many religions. That would get us into belonging again. But it's important. I like the phrase leaning on the air, expecting to be caught. I think that is completely beautiful. I wanted to comment on what you were saying, Aspasia, on the gender. I think this is very astute and also very important. I think like with the hikikomori in Japan, I don't think it's by chance that this started in Japan because it's a shame culture versus a guilt culture, which there's a difference of that. Your value in Japan is really weighed by if you get a job and you have a successful career. And of course, with the 3 lost decades in Japan, employment is very difficult. And if you get employment, you're working till midnight and getting good. Japan is there's a lot of problems in Japan. And I'm happy. I actually think Japan is basically where the entire world is going because they modernize without religion and basically all economic systems are going. Now, I'd have to explain this, but many of the hikikomori are people who can't get a job. They feel shame. They feel this anxiety when they encounter the other person. They feel like they're let down, so they're like, I'm just not going to interact with social people. Likewise, you're saying with the female, there's a certain danger. There's an anxiety that is felt in the presence of the other, right? I think this is even harder to work through if conversations have right and wrong answers. So one of the things, for example, many men, if I were to speak generally from my own experience, very few men growing up certainly did philosophical discussion. When they talked, there was a right and wrong answer, right? And if you disagreed with them, then you could even feel the certain fact that they were bigger than you, or so are you like, shut up, I'm bigger than you. You could actually feel that come to the forefront, right? In a right or wrong conversation. There is a way, if I were to say something, I would have to justify, but in a world without philosophical conversation, which is open-ended conversation, I don't think we should be surprised to see gender relations get worse. Because the open-ended conversation is where it's not a right or wrong, so you don't feel that aggression come to the forefront, because the male is exploring with the female and the female is exploring with the male, and that you're doing it together, and that physical difference doesn't come out as much. Likewise, if the hikikomori is interacting with people and they're not just asking right or wrong answers, do you have a job or not, then I think the likelihood of hikikomori go down, because conversations are not always going into I don't have status. And so this is the other issue. In an age upon which politics is unleashed upon the world, which you could argue internet does, without philosophy, means will be a massive unleashing of right or wrong conversations where someone's right and somebody's wrong. In that environment, we should not be surprised if gender dynamics get worse. We should not be surprised if classes separate, if occupations separate, because people are feeling shame, they're feeling nervous, they're feeling a various anxiety, and the act of conversing with people does nothing but make them feel that. The only people who are going to want to talk are the ones who are the richest or the strongest. Like this, why are people obsessed going to the gym now, right? Like rich is there's a certain, like, I'm going to find an area, dang it, where I'm superior. And then in every conversation, I'm going to make sure it goes to that topic. Yeah. Like, why do men talk about the gym all the time? Like, you'll hear that people that go to the gym want to talk about it. By all means, go to the gym all the time. Why are you doing this, though? To make sure I'm in a conversation where I'm not anxious. Mm-hmm. Dang it. Like, or why is this person always talking about the job? Because they're the CEO and they're not going to feel anxious in it. Mm-hmm. And so what you have are people who are basically avoiding conversation. It's all strategies of avoiding conversation. Or dominating conversation. It's just game theory. It's either avoidance or dominant strategy. The only way to have the non-rational best address of the now equilibrium is to people to have a different kind of conversation, which is an open-ended exploratory conversation. And if we don't have a culture that does that, then gender differences will explode. Social differences will explode. People, like rich people aren't going to be like people can play. Like in the past, rich people would be in the baseball stadium just like with the poor people and everyone. And now they have these booths and they're all separate. And people say, we hate that. No, you do not hate that. You say you do. But when you talk to them, you feel nervous the entire time. We say we hate the separation of the rich and the poor and the classes. No, we do not. No, we do not, because we're anxious the entire time. we say we hate the fact that we're not around diverse people and we're different. No, we're not, because we're anxious in every conversation we go into. We just say that because we know we're supposed to say that.
Yes.
But actually, practically, we live in such a way where we avoid it. Dang it. And so
yeah, I agree.
I think those things are at play. The screen, one of the reasons why I think people have come to the space is because, if you're someone who says like literature or likes to have ideas and there's no one in your immediate community that will do those things, then you need the social coordination mechanism to find those people, to actually have that sort of experiences and to gradually, here's the issue. The screen is not a problem if it is on a process of unveiling, a process of development, of finding people to encounter, to build up certain confidence and strength, to know about and to model these kind of conversations. But it has to be brought back. It has to be then brought back out, and it has to be figured out how to be brought to it. So there has to be a dialogue. This is a lot of what I think about, and it would be another subject. So the enemy is not the screen. The social coordination mechanism is very important. And also, people can get online and see people having conversations like this, and that makes them feel like, wait, I thought I was just broken. I thought there was just something wrong with me. This makes them feel, because in their immediate life, maybe everyone is telling them they are wrong. So it's very important to model that and make people feel permission in that. But then that feeling could become a problem, though, if you like that feeling and you never go back out and to figure out how to get into the lift, right? Now because then you're not training your emotional immune system. You're not training your nervous system, right? You think you're not. So that has to be thought. More needs to be said on that. But my point, and then I'll say things on prayer. My point is that the loss of open-ended conversation, which I think philosophy basically is, or I don't know what it is the loss of that is going to lead to an intensification of gender, social, racial, whatever differences. Because every conversation will be winner and loser, and screw that. People are like, I don't like that, so I'll go to my apartment and be a hikikomori. Because what do I get out of socialization other than the reminder that people are dangerous, or that I'm inferior, or that people don't listen? What does socializing do other than remind me that people suck? That's how people feel, and therefore they don't interact. So if we don't like that, if we want to change that, well, then we have to model a different conversation and make a point where when people speak with one another, they find themselves surprised to themselves by how much they enjoy it. When you get a world where the average person finds themselves surprised by how much they enjoy the conversation they have with people they encounter, then you will start to rebuild the social system. But until that day, when people are not pleasantly surprised by how much they find themselves enjoying the average conversation they have with the random person they encounter, then don't be surprised if people are hikikomori, because you haven't made a good case why isn't that a good course of life? We haven't created the conditions of possibility to pose a strong argument and a strong alternative. I actually think this is related to prayer. Also, before I forget, for the individual one who says, well, there are liberals who are celebrating the death of Kirk, and that must mean they want the death of me, or everyone no one has ever listened. Well, I would say that it's just very interesting. Father Zosima, when he was talking, there was a guy in the Brothers Karamazov, and so I think, this is kind of a theme of Dostoevsky. And someone comes up to Father Zosima and he says, Father, forgive me. I came to love humanity and lost the ability to love an individual. And the whole idea is that many of the great evils in history are a result of loving humanity, but in that love of humanity and abstraction, losing the ability to love an individual, right? There's something inverse kind of going on to that now, where people are, Father, forgive me. I came to hate humanity and thus never encountered an individual, or never made a point to encounter an individual. And what I mean by that is when people talk, it's like, well, liberals are celebrating, it's this kind of category of people, right, that don't listen, right? Get off your computer. Stop hearing about liberals, because that's an abstraction. Go into your... Do you think there's not a single liberal in 50 miles of you who will not listen to you? Go find them and meet their face. Go find the counter in your lived experience to your experience online. Go find them. Do your best. And if you work really, really hard to go find that individual and you don't find that person or you never encounter it, you will be changed by that very effort into someone who is actually not so prone to perhaps hate the other. Because along the way, you'll meet a lot of people and you'll see the world is quite vast. And you will actually also probably encounter that, oh, I actually run into conservatives who are just as hateful as those liberals that I think are so hateful, right? And it's also going to be very productive to say, oh, there are actually conservatives who will celebrate when liberals die. Oh, no, I should not think that this is just an us versus them thing. It turns out that there's plenty of good and evil to go around, if you will, on all sides. It's very important to go run into individuals, not categories. To try when we start feeling feelings of nobody doesn't exist. This idea that they never listen. I've tried that and nobody listens. Well, nobody doesn't exist. Nobody doesn't exist. And if you say that and you say that nobody listens, the other thing though I want to say though with this, and I think it's important, like on this idea of, well, I've tried listening and I've tried understanding and it never works. Well, there's actually a number of skills you need. Have you learned how to freed speech? Do you have freed speech? Have you figured out how to help people think about a topic in a new way? Have you learned Socratic method? Have you learned philosophy? Have you learned poetry? Have you learned literature? It actually is not enough to listen and be willing to understand. Because if you're willing to listen and understand, but you're not able to help someone else understand by breaking them out of their entrapments in their mind, then no, it's not going to do anything. But then, of course, if you don't listen, then you're only manipulating. So you have to do both, right? Like you have people with the skills of changing people, but they're not listening. So that's manipulation. But then if you're just listening and willing to understand, but you don't have the ability to make people see how they're assuming certain things in their categories or how to introduce them to new ideas in an artful way versus banging them over the head. If you haven't learned how to speak in a manner that brings people in, well, then no, they're not going to change. So there's more skills that are involved. So maybe the problem is that there are other skills that need to be learned. No, you don't change. Empathy alone does not change people. Empathy is a prerequisite for a non-manipulative world, but empathy is nothing more than perhaps an ability to accurately assess the terrain of the relation, the way the maps are interacting. Okay, you successfully can tell how the maps are interacting. Well, now do you have the skill to bring someone to the girdle point? That's a different skill. That's a different capacity. You are going to have both. But I would also applaud the individual to say, who's going like, I've listened and tried to be understanding. That's a lot more than a lot of people have done. So don't be discouraged. Just now think of the other skills that have to be employed, right? And if you don't have if you don't have the listening part, it's all going to be manipulation. But if you only have the listening and the empathy, then you're not going to be able to break people out of their entrapment. So you have to have both. Prayer, and then I'll pass it. But the prayer conversation is very, very big, and so I really like what you were saying on praise. So really, really pay attention. And prayer has always mystified me. And without getting into a very long thesis on it, I'll just tell you what I've come to decide to think about prayer. So one of the things that I find very interesting is I take seriously William Ong and people that say that basically before the printing press, the average person really didn't have a deep inner capacity. Like in an oral society, if you felt something, you showed it. You spoke. So the idea is this. In a oral society, you really didn't have an inner voice at all. Like you really did not have much of an inner voice. So when these traditions are talking about prayer, which is often in oral traditions, not literary societies, because even in like Judaism, it was still mostly oral. There were scrolls, it was oral. I wonder if a lot of the understanding of prayer was the beginning of the effort to develop an inner voice in a world that didn't have it, actually. Like the voice speaking inside of you all the time. I sometimes wonder if the idea of prayer was to gain that voice that now we all actually have. We all actually have it because we have the book. We all have an inner voice. Actually, in a sense, we're praying 24/7 now, right? We all have an inner voice. I do think, and again, I can't prove it. I think a lot of the talk of prayer in many traditions, and it's interesting, what's the difference between prayer and meditation? There is a difference between prayer and meditation. The emphasis on prayer is more in the Western religions, right? Well, these tend to be often, this would get into a lot, the verbal, they're writing, there's documentations, printing press, et cetera, so forth. Prayer seems to be the inner voice itself, right? And if you take this very seriously, then every time you use your inner voice, you're praying, which means every time you use your inner voice, you're speaking with God. And guess what we mostly use our inner voice to do? Talk about how we hate our coworkers. Talk about how angry we are. We have this voice going on about our anxiety, right? For me, that has been very important, is saying every time I use my inner voice, I'm actually praying. So I better pay attention. Do I really want God to be listening to me talking about how angry I am at my coworker? Do I really want God listening to how mad I am all the time or how anxious I am? It has been used as a certain, it's not how do I, like, it's this idea that I am praying. I am in a written society where everyone has an inner voice, and I use this inner voice terribly. I don't use it well. I don't use it well. I want to use it well. I want to use it not to get angry or to talk about how stupid everyone is. I want to use it in a manner. One, I want to actually, if I think of the inner voice as prayer, then I'm going to turn it off a lot, actually. And I'm going to try to be present and perceive more than think. I'm actually going to be more embodied, because when I use this inner voice, I'm praying. So that's a big deal, and I have to pay attention, and I'm speaking to God. So let me try to not use that inner voice a lot and actually be in my body a lot more. And then when I do use it, to not be using it just to get angry, not to just be using it to talk about how everyone's wrong and I'm right, or not using it in a manner that's just worried. To use that inner voice in a manner that is building the kingdom, which of course that inner voice will then be saying, okay, at 5 o'clock I have this meeting. Well, you're building the kingdom. There is places for using the inner voice to do these kind of tasks, but am I doing it in a manner that suggests the presence of God? So to me, this has been, once I have begun thinking about prayer as the inner voice itself, which again, if you look how Jesus talks about prayer, it's solitary, it's a very interesting, and I don't mean to say there's no place for communal prayer, but let me say this, verbal communal prayer, out loud prayer, will absolutely be made in the image and likeness of your inner prayer and your inner voice. And if your inner voice has not been sanctified, then your verbal voice will not be either. And so I have found it, and of course, I'm not saying I'm any sort of saint at the inner voice, but really saying like the inner voice is prayer. That is praying. Then I'm going to really try to get some control over that inner voice. I'm going to try to make it be like Jesus. I have found that important. And I think basically in this age, because when the temperature is going up, when the political situation seems like we're all going to go crazy, I promise you that is the reflection of a society that has no control over its inner voices, where its inner voices are nonstop talking about anger, and like people's inner voices are on full steam and they can't turn them off, right? So basically what's happening is people are using a spiritual power to do legion, to do something demonic, right? Well, if we want to get the temperature down, if we want to change the political discourse, then yes, we need people to pray, which for me, to say we need people to pray means that people come to treat their inner voice as speaking to God. So freaking pay attention.
I need to sit with that for a while. That's very interesting. There's definitely, I will say just briefly, I mean, I definitely relate the mode of thinking sort of just on overdrive, like the just being with ourselves, just constantly thinking, and how the stream, our feeds, just the stream of social media that we can always have access to is another way to generate this scrolling and this feed of our internal thought as well. and to control it and to give it direction and topics and all of that I see as ways of removing ourselves from the present moment. And that is really where I see the body and emotions as can be quite anchoring. And that tuning into those is more likely to help us to be present than that. Yeah. Seth, have you got anything on that before I have to take off? I'm sorry I have to take off.
It's time to end, but I'll just say, for anyone who watched the whole thing, I hope you try that on as an experiment, what Danielle just said.
Mm.
And the other thing I would say is, if I pay attention with that intention, when my voice is resonating in my throat out loud and I'm speaking to the two of you or my daughter or my coworker or the bus driver or anyone, it could become, I mean, I think the ordering of the thing is true. I really have to start by sanctifying the inner voice. That I don't think, I mean, it probably just wouldn't logically, I can't see how it would work in the other direction. But at the same time, one last thought that I've been thinking about, but I'll make it short, is just when we say we're working on ourselves, as many people will say these days, I'm working on myself, I'm trying to be a better person, right? There's what we call the inner work. And that's important, but the inner work can be, I forget the phrase, is it hikikomori?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I can stay at home and meditate all day as well.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. I maybe not stuck to my phone, but I'm just still working on myself. And so I just think that, if there's something we call outer work, which might be facing the other, if I meditate for an hour before I go out, I might have a better time of it. It might be nice, but at some point, if the event starts in an hour, at a certain point, it's time to leave the house so I can be at the event on time. And sometimes I won't be ready, but we have to, I think, practice without being ready, including the actual flow of life where, people are talking about the last headline and what do you think and what should we do? And it's perfectly valid to say, I don't know, but let's sit here and not know together. I mean, so I think that's a way to slow down the conversation, is just to admit that I don't know, which is another thing that I think we've been told we're not allowed to do, especially the men, maybe, but all of us. And
and this
plenty more to say, but
one thing that's just springing to my mind, and I really do have to go, is I think for me too, though, with prayer, there is something about how it straddles both worlds. So it's like a reverence for the inner space, but always with the aim of or the hope of some kind of momentum or movement, right? Like it's not just sitting in oneself for the sake of being in oneself there. And it really is those two things. And I think that's what I was speaking to about, that sense of like nudge, or like there's a, I think I just said it. I think I just said it. I'll just go around in circles. This is wonderful. This one really went so fast. I can't believe, I'm so sad I have to go. I can't believe how quickly it's gone. Really nice to be with you both. Thank you so much.
Very nice to be with both of you. It's always a pleasure and a joy. I always very much cherish you both. So thank you.
Yeah.